Welcome to another video in biology. We're discussing population ecology in this video. Population ecology is basically the study of the dynamics of populations. And there's three aspects of a population that we're going to be highlighting in this video. The first one is population density, because every population of, regardless of the species, human, insect, orcas, elephants, whatever the case may be, whatever that population, whatever the group of that species is, they tend to have these three characteristics that stays the same, that crosses the lines of species. So that's the density, population density, the spatial distribution of that population, and the growth rate of that population. Okay, so all these things have, these are the three main factors that play into how we describe the population of an organism. So let's dive into population density. This is the number of organisms that live per unit area. And usually we use kilometers, so per kilometer, square kilometer. So spatial distribution is a dispersion pattern of spacing of a population. So what that means is that we have different organisms that tend to distribute themselves, disperse themselves in the area that they live in a different pattern. Okay, so for example, the human race, you can see here. Now, the human race is actually unique in that there is no real pattern to how we populate or where we decide to locate ourselves. There's no limits to where we can live. We have scientific colonies in Antarctica, for example, an area where it's nothing but ice cold. You can't grow any plants. You can barely grow bacteria there. And then we also have people that live in the Amazon rainforest. So there's nowhere that we haven't been able to colonize as a human race. But as you can see here, I have a population density map, and you can see the different countries and the amount of people that live per area, per square kilometer. Now, this is not how big the country is, but how dense the country is. Okay, let me back up. So the brighter the red color, the more densely populated that country is. That means the more people they have living per area, the more crowded the cities are. Okay, if you see South America there, South America is kind of pink. Now there are millions of people in South America, but you also have millions of square kilometers that are not inhabited by people. Most people live in South America on the coastal areas, whereas the Amazon rainforest, for example, is sparsely populated. The US is a little bit more dense because we do have cities that are fairly evenly distributed throughout the entire country. Even though we do have vast areas of the country that are not populated, still it's a lot more evenly distributed than, let's say, South America or even North Africa, where the Sahara, the massive desert, is. Okay. So again, here's a population map of the United States. You can kind of see the dark purple areas that our population has densely moved itself into. So, and it coincides with the major cities across the U.S., like Los Angeles, San Diego, Southern California. You see that area in purple because there's a lot of people per square kilometer there. So it's a highly populated area. In the Northwest, you have Seattle, Portland, and in the South, like Texas, you have Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and Austin, the major cities. So all the major cities, as you would expect, have highly densely populated areas, which is what makes them major cities. Okay, we have the high rises, apartments. So we've developed apartments where we're building up now, so we're not limited by the amount of space that we have. And as you can see in the Midwest, in the central part of the U.S., it's more sparsely populated. So spatial distribution, these are the patterns of spacing of a population. So we have three different patterns that we're going to highlight. We have uniform dispersion. Okay, as you can see there, shown by the dots, the organism will evenly distribute itself in a given area. You have clumped dispersion, where the organisms will clump together in family groups, in tribal groups, in herds. And then finally we have random dispersion, where there is no set pattern as to where they decide to distribute themselves. They're just kind of all over the place. And here are some organisms that exhibit these patterns. Bears typically disperse themselves evenly. Okay, they have their territories, and they fiercely guard those territories. Female bears tend to have smaller territories, and they tend to overlap with male territories, which makes sense because how else are they going to bump into a male and reproduce? And then you have the American bison that tends to clump itself in what we call herds. Dolphins do the same thing. Orcas do the same thing, where they clump themselves, okay, into herds, and they swim around in these herds, in these groups. And then you have random dispersion. Deer. Deer are kind of all over the place. There is no pattern as to how and where they are. Sometimes you find them in herds. They clump together. But most of the time you'll find them kind of randomly going about just eating their grass. So population ranges. This particular term is discussing the ability to expand its population range because, or not being able to expand its population range due to the abiotic factors that are found in that region. So, for example, the bear. So let's go back to the organisms that we were just talking about. So we were talking about them in terms of spatial distribution, but there's also a pattern in the way in the area that they live in. So, for example, the bear on the left, you can see highlighted in purple. This is where we typically find bears. Now, that has a lot to do with the abiotic factors, the mountain ranges, the weather, the plant life. No, plant life is biotic. Um, but there are certain things that limit the organism to a certain area. If you look at the bison in the central part of the U.S., well, that makes a lot of sense because the central part of the U.S. there's massive grasslands, prairies, where they can just kind of roam and eat, and they're not being disturbed by mountain ranges or what have you. And the temperature's a little bit more moderate in the central part of the U.S. too. Uh, you have deer; they're all over the place. Again, they randomly disperse, and they're not usually hamstrung by mountains or anything like that. But you'll notice the blue area, notice the gray area in the Nevada, California area, the Utah area. That's a mountainous, desert, super hot area. So the abiotic factor that plays into where the deer live in, one of them is the temperature. It is super hot in those areas, and you don't typically find the deer there. Okay, so that's population ranges. Now let's look at a couple of other population limiting factors. We're going to look at two. One of them is density independent, and one is density dependent. Okay, so these are the two factors that play into how a population and where a population will live and how they behave. So a density independent factor, which is what we'll highlight first, okay, that means that this is a factor that is dependent on how many people live. Actually, I'm sorry, let me go back. Did I say independent? It's independent, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many people live in that area. As an example, hurricanes. Hurricanes don't care. They don't think about where or how many people live in a given area. There are certain factors that play into what creates a hurricane, and it's independent of how many people live there. Okay, hurricanes typically, or cyclones, they form in the middle of oceans where they gather energy from the water, and then they kind of move about gathering energy through water, and then sometimes they make landfall where in highly populated areas, and sometimes they don't. It doesn't matter. It's independent. It's an independent factor. Another independent factor are forest fires. Forest fires tend to happen in rural wilderness areas where they can be caused by lightning, and they just they rage on. And whether there's somebody living there or not, forest fires occur. So that's a density independent factor. Now, density dependent factors, okay, this is any factor in the environment that depends on the number of members of a population per unit area. Okay, so for example, diseases. Diseases don't typically happen or get passed on unless you have an area where there are people there to pass it on. So if I get the flu and I'm living in, let's say in the middle of nowhere, I'm on an island by myself, it doesn't matter because I'm the only one getting the flu. But let's say I get the flu and I go in the subway, I go to public transportation, a bus, then I can pass on that disease, and then that disease can be prevalent in that population. Okay, so that is a dependent factor. It is dependent on the number of people in that population per unit area. Competition. Okay, for example, let's say in a given area I have too many bears. Well, those bears are going to be competing for the same resources. They're going to be competing for bugs, for berries, for whatever it is they can find in a given area. the competition will occur, and then some of those bears might die off because of that. Parasites, same thing. Parasites are irrelevant if they don't have a population in which they can live off of. Okay, so lastly, let's talk about growth rate. Population growth rate, PGR, explains how fast a given population grows. The natality of a population is the birth rate in a given time period. Now, how you determine if a population is growing or not is you compare its natality rate to its mortality rate. How many people are being born compared to how many are dying. Now, there are other factors as well that play into that, which we'll get into in a second. But you'll see this played out, shown in a graph. It's called an exponential growth graph. Okay, this has an exponential line that you've seen in your math class. So exponential growth occurs when the growth rate is proportional to the size of the population. So you'll see that we have a lag phase. That lag phase on this graph is indicating a slow growth pattern. Okay, and this particular graph is discussing the mice population in millions. So the first month all the way through the 19th month, you might have a really slow growth phase, a lag phase. Come 20th, 21st month, that generation will continue to have babies, and then those babies will have babies, and then what you have now is an exponential growth pattern. Okay, this is growing immensely fast, and this is what happens with mice, where you get mice infestations. You may not have one initially, but then once those second and third generations start to have more mice, then you have an out of control growth rate. Carrying capacity. Now let's go back to those mice. Those mice, millions of them will be born, but eventually they're going to run out of resources and they're going to hit carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals in a species that an environment can support for the long term, and this is carrying capacity. Okay, so those mice will run out of resources, they'll run out of grain to eat, they'll run out of bugs to eat, and eventually there's going to be a massive competition for their limited resources, and then the population will begin to come down. Okay, so this graph right here, the logistics population graph, shows that. It shows, so we have an exponential curve, like we've seen before, but now we also have carrying capacity. And that is the line in which the population, as you can see, will then begin to hit another lag phase. So you have the maximum number of individuals that an environment can support. Okay, carrying capacity is limited by energy, water, oxygen, and nutrients. And here you have a lag phase, like we talked about before. And then you hit that exponential growth, which we call the S curve. As you can see, it looks like an S. And then because of competition and limited resources, some of that population, a lot of that population stops growing and it plateaus and then hits the carrying capacity, another lag phase. Okay? Now, a population stops increasing when the number of births is less than the number of deaths, or when emigration exceeds emigration. Now again, emigration is with an E, so that's people or population exiting a given area. Immigration, I with an N, meaning people or organisms are moving into a given area. So population will decrease when emigration with an E is high, and population will increase when immigration with an I is bigger than emigration.